Hello, my name is Michelle, and you're watching From Surviving to Thriving. Are you a narcissist or a codependent, and why am I even asking this question? Well, chances are, if you were brought up by a narcissistic parent, whether it was one parent, both parents, or a primary caregiver, the likelihood is that you're either a narcissist or a codependent. Now, obviously, there are exceptions to the rules, but that seems to be the norm. Now, you guys have heard me say narcissists breed narcissists. And in those videos where I talk about how a narcissist will often wind up with a child that is narcissistic as well, and it becomes generational, every now and then I'll get a comment by somebody saying, well, then how do you know that you're not narcissistic? Or how do you know that, or how do I know that I'm not narcissistic? And that's because I haven't brought up the fact that while narcissists breed narcissists, they also breed codependents, and if you're not one, you're most likely the other. In my case, I became codependent. Now, why some people choose one route or the other, and it's not necessarily a conscious choice, could be discussed in another video, but I wanted to talk about this topic because I've gotten so many questions lately that say, well, am I the narcissist? My parents were narcissistic. They'll say, I think that I'm codependent, but sometimes I read something about narcissists and I feel like that applies to me as well. So today I wanted to talk about 5 similarities that narcissists and codependents have in common so that anyone that's wondering can see that it's understandable because they do have a lot in common. And while they act very different on the outside, some of their psychological features internally are very similar. So it makes sense that sometimes you might wonder. And I've had so many people say, well, I worry about myself because I see things in myself that make me think that I'm a narcissist. So if you're worrying and you care and you actually care, that's a really good sign that you're not narcissistic. But I still wanted to give you guys some more pieces of evidence that help you to see that while they have certain similarities, it doesn't mean that if you exhibit certain things that makes you a narcissist. So let's talk about those 5 things that narcissists and codependents have in common. Okay, number one is dependency. A codependent has disconnected from themselves. They don't communicate with themselves. They don't check in with themselves. They're always focused externally on others, what others are thinking, how others view them, other people's opinion of them. They're constantly thinking that way, and so they're dependent on how other people view them in order to feel like a good person. Oh, they like me, I'm a good person. Oh, look, they think I'm a good person, I must be a good person. And it's always dependent on other people's views. Narcissists, not only do they not check in with their true selves, their inner selves, they've kind of killed their inner being and replaced it with a false image. So they communicate with the world through this false image. That's why they're always polishing their image. That's why they're always making sure that their image is what is most important as opposed to who they truly are. And that's why they often have 2 personalities, because when they're outside in public, that's when they bring out their image. And when they come home and no one but their family is looking, it's like they hang it up like a winter coat, and that image comes off and who they really are is there. But instead of working on who they really are, all they ever really do is polish that false image for others. And so they're dependent on how other people view that image in order to feel validated. And that's why they're always seeking narcissistic supply from others. They can't generate narcissistic supply from themselves. They need it from others, whether it's positive supply or negative supply, and that's what validates them. So both the codependent and the narcissist are completely dependent on other people's view of themselves. And some people might say, oh, that's impossible, that a narcissist is dependent on other people. They're so in love with themselves. They're so self-entitled. They hold themselves to such a high, rank in their own eyes. But the fact that they even crave that recognition, they don't even just crave it, they need that recognition. It's like an insatiable need for approval, for attention, for adoration. That makes them dependent on other people. Once again, because they cannot generate narcissistic supply on their own. So it's one thing they have in common. The second thing they have in common is the fact that they both have deep-rooted shame. And that shame is a result of things that they went through as a child at the hands of narcissistic parents, the neglect or the abuse, the emotional abuse. Shame is a really difficult emotion or feeling to deal with as adults. Imagine being a child dealing with shame. And so children wind up developing different ways of coping with that shame. And that's one of the ways how a narcissist winds up breeding a narcissist or a codependent. Sometimes, or a part of it, I should say, it's not the whole reason, but a part of it is the way that the child copes with that shame. One way that children wind up coping with shame is by, they see their parent unhappy, their parent has just made them feel this shame, and however parenting way that they did, and so the child now tries everything in their power to make that parent happy. They chase after that love and approval all the time, and they wind up growing up into being people-pleasing codependents. Another coping skill is the child feels that shame, and it makes them feel out of control because they never know when that shame is coming. And so they seek to control their environment, to dominate it. They want power so that they can control that and keep out that horrible emotion or that horrible feeling that shame can often bring about. So instead of seeking that parent's approval and love and acceptance, they seek out power and feeling superior. And that's what they use to help them to not feel inferior and feel those feelings of shame. In fact, it helps them to keep that neediness and all vulnerability away. If that's their coping skill, guess what they become when they grow up? They tend to go more along the lines of becoming a narcissist. But that's another thing that they have in common, that shame. Another thing that narcissists and codependents have in common is their denial. Codependents, when they were young, often had their feelings and their needs denied to them. In fact, they were often shamed for even having feelings, even having needs. And so they grow up doing that very same thing that was done to them as children, but this time they begin doing it to themselves. And that's denying their needs, denying their feelings, denying their wants, their desires, their passions, often in order to accommodate someone else's desires, needs, passions, and wants. Narcissists also deny their emotional needs. For example, a narcissist would never admit that they're being demanding. Why? Because that means they need you. And need in a narcissist's brain is equivalent to weak and inferior. So they deny their feelings altogether. How many times will a narcissist deny their own feelings when it's absolutely obvious what they're feeling? I've even done videos on this about how a narcissist will have their veins bulging out and be saying that they're not angry and they're not hurt by anything that just occurred to make them feel angry. Because if they admit that they're angry because they were hurt, that means you have power over them. So it's this constant denial of emotional needs. They both do that, narcissists and codependents. So the fourth thing that narcissists and codependents have in common is their lack of boundaries. Now, because of the lack of boundaries in a narcissist, they don't know where they end and other people begin. And so everyone is viewed as an extension of themselves, which is why when something goes wrong, they don't blame themselves ever. It's always the other person's fault. They will project everything they're feeling that's negative and that they don't want to admit that they feel, they'll project it onto someone else. There's no boundary as far as where that person ends and where the narcissist begins. And so once again, everything they can't tolerate in themselves, they'll project into their family members or people around them as if they possessed it, because in their brains, that's how they see people, as simply as an extension of themselves. So when something goes wrong or something that the narcissist can't tolerate happens, the narcissist will project, will criticize others, will blame others, will treat others bad. Well, while the motives are different and the way they go about it is different, the codependent handles things in the same way. The only difference is that all of that criticism and that blame and that unkind behavior is directed at themselves. They blame themselves. They criticize themselves. They loathe themselves. Whereas the narcissist will react with aggression towards others, criticism of others, the codependent does that to themselves. And the way that both react to shame or things that go wrong or things that make them feel bad shows that they both have difficulty with boundaries. Boundaries with others, boundaries with themselves, and that's something that they have in common. And the last thing that I wanted to mention, and there's obviously, this isn't an all-inclusive list, but these were just 5 things that I wanted to mention that they have in common. And the last one was control. A narcissist seeks control of other people. We call them flying monkeys. They seek control of people in order to keep their image clean. The way they go about seeking their control is what makes the narcissist and the codependent different. The narcissist will manipulate to seek control. The codependent, because they also are dependent on what other people think about them, they'll seek to control others by people pleasing. Their desire of seeking control isn't with bad motives, but they people please because they think they need the approval of other people to validate their own worth. And so because your worth has to do with your happiness, your sense of safety, your security, your self-love, because it's so important, they seek to control it by people pleasing. So I thought it was interesting when I was examining how they were similar. And the reason I thought it was important to share it is because so many people wonder, am I a narcissist? Am I the codependent? Which one am I? And I wanted to start this year on this topic because I think for me on my personal journey, healing codependency became the last thing needed in order to feel really healed. And I say that because when you're learning about narcissistic abuse, the first thing you start to do is learn about the narcissist. You know, most of us stumbled upon narcissistic personality disorder either because somebody mentioned it to us, or we were putting in keywords on the internet and we found a blog or YouTube videos that talked about it, and it opened our eyes. And so our first step was learning about the narcissistic abuse. The second step, often people start making those changes of taking their power back, and they start putting boundaries down. They also start to do an inventory of their life and kind of get rid of toxic people that are really destroying you from the inside out. That's often the process. And sometimes they stop their healing journey there. They've learned about narcissistic abuse, they've learned the red flags, they've cleaned their life of narcissistic people, and they think they're done with their healing journey. And then oftentimes those people will say, well, why do I keep attracting narcissists? Why do I keep picking the same kind of person, even though I know the red flags? Why is this always happening to me? Often it's because they stopped their healing journey too soon and they didn't do the inner work to change and heal themselves. I liken it to when you go to the doctor and you need something stronger than over-the-counter medicine, and you're prescribed, an antibiotic, and you're instructed to take it for 10 days. Sometimes there are people who will take it, and after the 3rd day, they're feeling better. So what do some people do? Well, they're like, I don't got to keep taking this, I feel better. They stop their healing journey too soon, and that usually often results in a relapse. Well, it's the same thing with our emotional healing. We have to learn about the narcissist, we have to clean up our lives, we have to learn how to avoid them, but then we have to do the inner work that caused us to be attracted to a narcissist in the first place. We have to do the inner work to heal ourselves so that we change our future patterns. Because in the end, the goal isn't to just live a narcissistic-free life. That's good. That's very important, but that's not enough. The goal is to really be happy. And one of the only ways that you can truly be happy is starting with the relationship you have with yourself. And so that's why I wanted to start off this year really focusing on overcoming those internal programs that were instilled in us when we were children, when we were young, and work on those, because honestly, that's the only way we can ever really feel happy with ourselves and really feel like we're reaching the best version of ourselves. It starts with how we feel about ourselves, not how other people feel. It's not about having a successful external relationship with someone else. Those are all nice things, but they can only really be successful if we're healed on the inside. And that's what I wanted to start this new year talking about.